When his fighter plane was shot from the sky, he braced for the torture and death he'd been promised. Instead, they did something that would change his life forever and prove why America won more than just the war. This is the story of Hans Werner Lurch and the moment one sergeant's decision rippled through the next 60 years. March 1945. The world was burning. High above the Rhine Valley, Hans Werner Lurch's Messerschmitt was a falling star of black smoke and shattered metal. American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, circled above him like silver wolves stalking their wounded prey, their job done. He was 26 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned test pilots, and he was about to die in enemy territory. His gloved hands shook on the control stick, not from the terror of the impending crash, but from the chilling certainty of what would come after. If he survived the bailout, he would face American soldiers. And Hans knew, with the cold dread instilled by years of conditioning, exactly what that meant. For years, Goebbels's relentless propaganda machine had filled every German mind with baroque nightmares of American captivity. He'd heard the stories whispered in pilot briefings and smoky mess halls. Americans tortured prisoners for information, their methods crude and brutal. They murdered German pilots on sight, especially test pilots who knew too many secrets about the Reich's wonder weapons. Some stories claimed they handed Luftwaffe prisoners over to the Russians, which was a slow, agonizing death sentence in the Siberian gulags. Other whispers spoke of island prison camps where men starved on bread and water, where guards beat you senseless for the crime of speaking German. Hans was not naive enough to believe all of it, but he had seen with his own eyes what happened to shot-down American pilots in Germany. Some Wehrmacht units still followed the old rules of military honor, but others did not. And the SS, they had executed Allied airmen just for surviving their crashes. He had heard about it firsthand from Wehrmacht officers who were disgusted by such a flagrant violation of the warrior's code. Why would the Americans be any different? Why would they show mercy to an enemy pilot who had spent 4 years helping to refine the very weapons that killed their brothers in arms? The altimeter was spinning down. 2,000 feet, 1,500. Through the shattered spider-webbed canopy, he could smell the acrid cocktail of burning oil and hydraulic fluid mixing with the cold March air. The fighter that had crippled him was long gone, its pilot probably already radioing his position to ground forces. They would be waiting for him. 1,000 feet. Time to jump or die burning. Hans grabbed the canopy release with his left hand, his right fumbling with the harness buckle. The metal was slick with his own blood. He'd taken shrapnel in his shoulder when the first savage burst of .50 caliber rounds tore through his cockpit. The wound throbbed with each frantic heartbeat, a warm, sticky tide of blood soaking through his flight suit. A fleeting image of his wife, Hildegard, and their little daughter back in Bad Wörishofen flashed through his mind. Would they even be told what happened to him? Or would he just disappear into some forgotten American camp, another name on a list of men who never came home? 500 feet. The Bavarian countryside rushed up at him, a patchwork of green fields and dark forests he had flown over 1,000 times, now transformed into hostile territory. He pulled the release. The canopy ripped away with a shriek of tortured metal. The ice-cold wind blasted his face, stealing his breath and scouring the tears from his eyes. He hauled himself up against the crushing G-forces and threw his body into the void. The parachute snapped open with a violent jerk, wrenching a gasp of pure agony from him as the straps dug into his injured shoulder. Below, his Messerschmitt augured into a farmer's field in a geyser of earth and twisted metal. A column of oily black smoke billowed against the impossibly blue spring sky. 4 years of test flying, hundreds of hours evaluating every fighter the Reich produced, from the venerable 109 to the terrifying Me-262 jet. And it ended. ended here, drifting down into enemy hands with nothing but his flight suit and the priceless knowledge locked in his head. Knowledge the Americans would surely torture out of him. He could see them now. Tiny figures, soldiers, running across the field toward his landing spot, their rifles raised. Jeeps bounced along dirt roads, kicking up plumes of dust. They would be on him in seconds. This was how it ended. Everything his superiors had warned him about was about to come true. But Hans Werner Lurch was about to discover something that would shatter every belief he held about the enemy. And 60 years later, he would still be trying to articulate the profound, life-altering truth of what happened in the next 60 seconds. Hans hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder exploding in a universe of white-hot pain. He collapsed into the soft, tilled earth, tasting blood and soil, gasping for breath. His parachute, caught by the breeze, dragged him several meters across the muddy field before he managed to slap the quick-release buckle with his good hand. The silk deflated with a sigh, a giant white surrender flag. He lay there for a moment, the world a spinning, painful blur, trying to force air into his lungs. Above him, the sky was a serene, indifferent blue, a stark contrast to the war being fought beneath it. He could hear the heavy pounding of boots growing closer, the sound of American voices shouting words he couldn't quite make out over the high-pitched ringing in his ears. This was it, the moment every German pilot dreaded. Hans forced himself to his knees, then shakily to his feet, swaying. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips to spatter on the new spring grass. He raised his right hand slowly, palm open. The universal gesture of surrender he had practiced in his mind 100 times, but never believed he would actually use. The American soldiers emerged from the tree line, 5 or 6 of them. United States Army infantry, their M1 rifles all trained on his chest. They were so young, he thought. Farm boys, mostly. Their faces smudged with dirt and etched with a weariness that went beyond their years. The lead soldier, Hans could see the sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, was shouting something, probably ordering him not to move. Hans's legs trembled beneath him, threatening to give way. He kept his hand raised, trying to convey with his eyes that he was no threat, that he was wounded, that he just wanted to survive. His mouth was too dry to speak. Even if he could find the words, his English was a clumsy collection of technical aviation terms, useless for pleading for his life. The sergeant approached cautiously, his rifle leveled at Hans's head. Hans could see the man's finger resting on the trigger, see the cold calculation in his eyes. Another soldier circled behind him. Hans felt rough hands patting him down, checking for weapons. They found nothing but his blood-soaked flight suit and the iron cross pinned to his chest, which one soldier unceremoniously ripped off and pocketed as a souvenir. "Luftwaffe," the sergeant said, his voice a low growl, looking at Hans's wings insignia. Then, louder to his men, "We got ourselves a Kraut pilot." Hans understood that much. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but only managed, "Ich bin, I am." The words died in his throat. The world tilted at an odd angle. The sergeant studied him for a long, silent moment, taking in the blood, the pallor of his face, the way Hans swayed on his feet like a tree in a storm. And then Hans saw something shift in the American's expression. It wasn't sympathy, not exactly, it was recognition. One soldier seeing another soldier in a world of trouble. Then the sergeant did something Hans never, ever expected. He lowered his rifle. "Get the medic," the sergeant called over his shoulder, his voice sharp with an urgency that stunned Hans. "This one's hurt bad." A younger soldier, barely 20, with a shock of red hair and a spray of freckles that made him look even younger, ran up with a canvas bag marked with a red cross. He dropped to one knee beside Hans, easing him down to sit in the grass with a surprising gentleness. Hans wanted to protest, to insist he could stand, but his legs finally gave out and the world was beginning to spin in lazy, nauseating circles. "Easy there, buddy," the medic said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who should hate him. He was already cutting away Hans's flight jacket with a pair of shears, exposing the ragged shrapnel wound in his shoulder. "Damn! You got chewed up pretty good." Hans flinched as the medic probed the wound, but the American's touch was careful, almost tender, nothing like the brutality he had braced for. Where was the interrogation? The rifle butt to the face? The revenge for all the American pilots shot down over Germany? "Morphine?" the medic asked the sergeant. "Give it to him. He's no good to intel if he bleeds out." Hans felt the sharp sting of a needle in his good thigh, and within seconds the searing pain began to recede, melting into a warm, distant fog. The medic was wrapping his shoulder now, talking to him in that same soft voice, even though Hans couldn't understand most of the words. But the tone was like someone talking to an injured friend, not a mortal enemy. "You're gonna be okay, Fritz. We'll get you patched up." The sergeant lit a cigarette, an American Lucky Strike, and to Hans's utter profound shock, offered it to him. Hans took it with a shaking hand, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. It tasted of real, rich tobacco, not the ersatz garbage they had been smoking in Germany for 2 years. The sergeant even held his lighter, cupping his hand against the spring breeze as if they were comrades sharing a break between patrols. "What's your name, Kraut?" the sergeant asked, speaking slowly as if to a child. "Lurch," Hans managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Hans Werner Lurch." "Well, Lurch, you picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky. War's almost over anyway. You're lucky you ran into us instead of some of the other boys. They might not have been so friendly." Hans understood maybe half of that, but he caught the essential message. He was lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. He had expected to be beaten or shot. Instead, an American medic was bandaging his wounds, and an American sergeant was sharing cigarettes as if they were fellow soldiers. It didn't make any sense. "Medic says we gotta get him to the aid station," one of the soldiers called out. "Load him in the jeep," the sergeant replied, already treating Hans's capture as a routine piece of business rather than a moment for vengeance. As they carried him across the field on a stretcher, Hans looked back at the burning wreckage of his Messerschmitt. 4 years of war condensed into that pyre of twisted metal and smoke. He had survived, wounded, a prisoner, but alive, in the hands of men who were supposed to be monsters. The jeep ride to the aid station was a jarring blur of morphine and confusion. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of English conversation he couldn't follow, seeing flashes of the devastated German countryside rolling past. Bombed-out buildings, burned tanks, the detritus of a lost war. At some point, someone gave him water, holding the canteen to his lips as if he were a child. Another impossible kindness. When he coughed and some of it spilled down his chin, the soldier just wiped it away and tilted the canteen more carefully. "Easy does it, Captain. Small sips." This was not what Goebbels had promised. This was not the American brutality he had been warned about since 1941. This was something else entirely. And Hans was about to discover it was only the beginning. He woke in a bed, not a cot on a concrete floor, not a pile of straw in some barn, an actual bed with clean white sheets that smelled of soap. His shoulder had been properly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull, manageable ache. Sunlight streamed through a real glass window, and somewhere nearby, someone was playing American swing music on a phonograph. Glenn Miller, if he wasn't mistaken. He blinked, trying to orient himself. This was clearly a field hospital, but nothing like the nightmare scenarios he had imagined. The room was clean, organized, staffed by medical personnel who moved with calm efficiency. Other wounded soldiers occupied nearby beds, some American, some German, lying side by side. No one was screaming, no one was being beaten. The Americans and Germans were receiving the exact same care. A nurse noticed he was awake, a woman in an American Army uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She approached with a clipboard and a professional smile that seemed genuine. "Guten Morgen, Captain Lurch," she said in heavily accented but functional German. "I am Captain Morrison. How is the pain this morning?" Hans struggled to sit up, his mind still foggy from the morphine. "You speak German?" "A little, enough to check on our patients." She examined his dressings with practiced hands, her touch professional but gentle. "You were lucky. The shrapnel missed the major vessels. You'll have full use of your arm once it heals. 6 weeks, maybe 8. "I do not understand," Hans said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Why are you treating me? I am your enemy." Captain Morrison gave him a puzzled look, as if the question itself was bizarre. "Because you are wounded," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "That is what we do." Over the next 3 days, Hans's confusion only deepened. The Americans fed him the same rations they gave their own wounded. Not bread and water, but hot meals with actual meat, vegetables, coffee with real cream, even chocolate bars. When he mentioned he was still hungry after one meal, an orderly brought him more without hesitation, without using it as leverage or demanding information in exchange. The medical care was meticulous. A surgeon came by daily to check his wound, changing dressings and watching for infection with a kind of careful attention Hans hadn't seen in German military hospitals in years. They gave him penicillin, the miracle drug the Germans had heard whispers of but rarely had access to. Pain medication came regularly, on schedule, not withheld as punishment. But the biggest shock was the human element. The nurses asked about his comfort. The orderlies helped him wash and dress without a hint of cruelty or mockery. One young private, a kid from Iowa named Miller, with an open, friendly face, even tried to teach him English phrases during his rounds, laughing good-naturedly at Hans's terrible pronunciation. "No, no," Miller would say, grinning. "It's thank you, not sank you. You gotta make the th sound. See?" He would stick his tongue between his teeth to demonstrate, looking ridiculous, but endlessly patient. "We'll work on it, Captain. You've got time." This casual friendship bewildered Hans. Miller was 19, had probably lost friends to German fighters, and had every reason to hate a Luftwaffe pilot. Yet here he was, treating Hans like a comrade instead of a murderer. On his 4th day, a United States Army Air Forces officer arrived. A major named Patterson, maybe 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He pulled up a chair beside Hans's bed. "Captain Lurch," he said in perfect, unaccented German. "I understand you are a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Quite an experienced one from what we've gathered." Hans's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought, the interrogation, the moment the mask of kindness would fall away. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "I was assigned to the Erprobungsstellen, the test centers." Patterson nodded, studying a file. "The Reich's aircraft evaluation facilities. You've flown most of the Luftwaffe's fighters, I imagine. The Me-262s, the jets." This was dangerous territory. Hans chose his words with care. "I flew many aircraft types, sir. It was my assignment." "I'm sure you did," Patterson said, his tone conversational. "Here's the thing, Captain. The war is almost over. Germany is finished. The question now isn't who wins. The question is what happens next. What happens to men like you?" Hans said nothing, waiting for the trap. "We've captured a lot of your aircraft," Patterson continued casually. "Jets, rocket planes, fascinating machines. But we need someone who understands these aircraft to help us evaluate them. Someone with real experience." Hans stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. You want me to help you?" "I want you to do what you've always done, Captain. fly and evaluate aircraft. Except now, you'd be doing it for us." Patterson smiled. "The alternative is a POW camp until this thing officially ends. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. But what stunned Hans was the offer itself. They weren't torturing him. They were proposing a job. They were acknowledging his expertise. "Why would you trust me?" Hans asked, genuinely baffled. "Who said anything about trust?" Patterson's smile widened. "You'll be watched. But we need your skills. And frankly, Captain, you've got nowhere else to go." Hans thought of Hildegard and his daughter. He thought of the ruins of Germany. And then he thought about what he loved most in the world: flying. The Americans were offering him a chance to keep doing the one thing he was born to do. "I will help you," he said quietly. Patterson stood and offered his hand. Hans shook it, the surreal nature of the moment washing over him. A Luftwaffe test pilot shaking hands with an American major, not enemies but colleagues. "Welcome aboard, Captain," Patterson said. "Let's get that shoulder healed up. We've got a lot of airplanes for you to fly." Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945. Hans heard the news in the officers' mess at the base near Frankfurt, surrounded by American pilots who cheered, embraced, and wept with relief. The war in Europe was over. Hans sat quietly, processing what this meant. His nation lay in ruins. Everything he had fought for had been for nothing, or worse than nothing, given what was now coming to light about the concentration camps and the systematic murder. But his work with the Americans continued. If anything, it accelerated. Hans evaluated dozens of captured German aircraft. Not just fighters, but experimental designs, rocket planes, and jets that had never seen production. His reports were detailed, honest, and invaluable. He wasn't just providing technical data. He was providing context, explaining the desperate design philosophies born of resource constraints and a deteriorating war. Then, in August, Major Patterson came to him with a proposal that seemed impossible. "Captain Lurch," he said, "the Navy's test pilot program has authorized me to offer you a position." Hans looked at him blankly. "A position? As a civilian contractor, you'd be released from POW status, granted special immigration status, and allowed to bring your family to the United States." Patterson slid the papers across the desk. "It's not charity. We need your expertise as we develop our own jet program. You'd be working alongside our test pilots, contributing to research that will shape aviation for the next decade." Hans stared at the papers. "You want me to come to America? To stay?" "We want you to keep doing what you do best," Patterson said. "This is your chance to keep flying, to support your family, to build a new future." Hans thought about it for 3 days. He wrote to Hildegard. Her response was unflinchingly practical. "We have nothing left here, Hans. The house is destroyed. There is barely any food. If the Americans will take us, we should go." In December 1946, Hans Werner Lurch signed the papers. He was not unique. Operation Paperclip would bring hundreds of German scientists to America. But Hans was different. He wasn't a rocket scientist. He was a pilot, a former enemy whose humanity had been recognized first. The Americans flew Hildegard and his daughter to Washington, D.C. in early 1947. Hans met them at the airport. His daughter, now 5, hung back shyly, studying this stranger in American clothes who claimed to be her father. But Hildegard, she threw her arms around him and wept, her body shaking with sobs that came from 2 years of fear and uncertainty. Hans held her, his own tears flowing freely. "I didn't know if I would ever see you again," she whispered in German. "I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "We are here. We made it." Eventually, his daughter came to him and, with a shy smile, called him Papa. Hans picked her up, overwhelmed by how much he had missed, and made a silent promise to never leave them again. They settled near Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. The Navy provided a small house in a neighborhood of other military families. It was paradise compared to bombed-out Germany. Running water, electricity, stores filled with food. Hans flew experimental aircraft for the Navy, contributing to the development of jet fighters that would serve in Korea and beyond. His colleagues, American pilots who had fought the Luftwaffe, became his friends. They had each other over for dinner. They celebrated holidays together. Captain Jake Larson, a P-51 ace who had once been wary of him, stood as godfather to Hans's second child, a son born in America in 1949. Hans never forgot what the Americans had done for him. In interviews decades later, he would speak with raw emotion about those first days after his capture. "I could have ended up in Soviet hands," he would say, his German accent still faint after decades in America. "They were just 30 kilometers away. I heard stories from Luftwaffe pilots who ended up in Soviet camps. Starvation, forced labor. Many did not come back." He would pause, the weight of that alternate history hanging in the air. "Instead, I fell into American custody, and they saved my life. Not just physically. They gave me a future when I had no right to expect one. That sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for a medic, I never learned his name, but he changed everything." Hans Werner Lurch worked as a test pilot until 1963. He contributed to the development of jet fighters, carrier operations, and early supersonic flight research. The boy from Württemberg, who had started with gliders, had become a bridge between nations, between enemies and allies. In 1985, a military historian asked him what he had learned from fighting for Germany and then working for America. Hans was quiet for a long moment. "I learned that the values a nation claims to hold are tested not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies," he said finally. "Germany claimed to represent civilization, but we treated our enemies with brutality. America claimed to believe in human dignity and the rule of law, and they actually lived up to it, even when it was inconvenient." He paused, then continued softly. "I also learned that showing mercy is not the same as being weak. The Americans who captured me were not soft. They had just won the most destructive war in history. They were strong enough to win, but also disciplined enough to follow their own rules. That is real strength. That is the kind of strength that builds something lasting." He leaned forward, emphasizing his next point. "And after the war, it won the peace. Germany became America's ally because we remembered how we were treated. We remembered the medical care, the food, the respect. We remembered that America offered us a future instead of revenge. That memory shaped post-war Germany more than any treaty ever could."
Thank you for listening. Please share your thoughts, like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe for more.